And so now we'll, with the telephone calls, and go on to World Watchers. And this is Mae Brussell. It's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. And it's broadcast number 642, March the 26th, 1984. We missed the anniversary last week. March 21st this week of 1933 is when Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany just 50 years ago. And he really was a genius. That Fourth Reich is just booming along, and he must have a lot of satisfaction in knowing how well the system has been working in the last 50 years. It has not faded away. Whatever charisma or control he had still seems to be around. We begin the program with a resume of events that took place just a year ago tonight, to see how fast the world spins. Just a year ago tonight, I got a picture of Fritz Kramer from the Pentagon, thanks to Congressman Panetta. A negative photograph, February 27th, 1970. And then I took a picture of a Fritz Kramer, who was Hitler's general, and sent the Henry Kissinger's mentor and Hitler's general to Fritz Kramer in Washington, D.C., and had the two pictures side by side and said, "Is this you?" He wasn't outraged. He didn't answer me. He didn't say, "Oh, I can see where you might think it was." I didn't get an answer, which doesn't prove that it is the same person, but it's been a year, and he's still in the offices, I presume, with retired General Daniel Graham, who's pushing for the space stations, and they share offices in Washington, D.C. I don't know what else he does. He's never photographed with Herr Kissinger when he travels around, and on the sheet that I typed up about Kissinger being in San Jose, I asked the question why he's never seen, why he isn't visible. I was talking a year ago about the Bulgarian connection to shooting the Pope, the propaganda that was on NBC, and how the CIA agents in the United States were being castigated for stopping to discredit the Bulgarian connection. The CIA refused to go along with the Bulgarian story that NBC was pushing. Incidentally, there's a documentary or a book out on NBC slanting the news and propaganda, particularly the way they covered the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and slanted the massacre, which was bad enough. And I thought of Marvin Kalb and Bernard Kalb, and we talked about the evidence of the shooting of the Pope. It was already a couple of years that since that happened, since 1981, and they keep pushing the communist link, the Bulgarian KGB link. There was a story this last January that a military indictment from Istanbul came out that said Mehmet, M-E-H-M-E-T, Ali Agca, who's serving a life sentence for shooting Pope John Paul II, ran a smuggling racket in Istanbul before he was arrested and escaped from Turkey. This is a new article out of Turkey that said he was part of smuggling before 1979, and that he has been charged in absentia with the murder of a newspaper man. Many of you know that, Abdi İpekel, I-P-E-K-E-L, former editor-in-chief of a newspaper in Turkey. But this article confirmed that he had long been in smuggling and narcotics traffic before he killed the editor, and of course he was allowed to walk out of that jail and mingled with trained assassins in the Middle East and in Frankfurt, and traveled around Europe before he was outside the Vatican and shot at the Pope. I also heard this week that Sergei Antonov, who was charged as part of that conspiracy, Agca had named him as part of the conspiracy. Antonov served over a year in jail as a suspect. The Italian government released him, and now they're calling him back. They're going to put him back in prison. I don't know what the new evidence is, but they're ready to pull him in and put him back in prison. A subscriber to World Watcher sent me an article from Kansas that I really appreciated, and it had to do with Madeleine Murray O'Hare, and her son, Bill Murray, was speaking in Kansas this last month, and he's a Christian. He tells what it was like to have mom as his mother is an atheist. He's a former atheist, and he was telling the problems that he had growing up and going to people's homes. She was afraid they'd have prayer at the dinner. And he was giving a speech in Kansas, auspices of a super prayer breakfast. And he was going to talk. It said, Mr. Murray will talk about information on why the Soviet Union refused citizenship to self-declared American atheist, his mother, and what relationship the Lee Harvey Oswald family had with Madeleine Murray O'Hair. Now, that was a complete surprise to me. I didn't know there was a relationship between Lee and Marina Oswald with Madeleine Murray O'Hair. And they came at a time that there's a court battle in Los Angeles taking place because Larry Flynt had signed over or given power of attorney to Madeleine Murray O'Hair, the atheist, and her son John, and Larry Flynt's brother is fighting this in court to keep her from having control of Hustler magazine. He wrote this letter saying that she had the power of attorney to take over Hustler, and she was moving into his offices and taking over the organization while he is confined to Butler, which is an institution for mind control, and goodness knows what they're doing to him there. Somebody who listens to these broadcasts sent me Bob Cutler's compilation of information of Gordon Novell. He's one of the fellows that moved into Larry Flynt's home and into the Hustler offices, and there's a resume of Novell's activities in the CIA and how he worked at Double Check organization and the Schlumberger outfit that armed the Bay of Pigs, and worked with Guy Bannister, who was from the World Anti-Communist League and the FBI, and worked with Clay Shaw. And this was Gordon Novell, who moved into Larry Flynt's house when he started writing about the Kennedy assassination and Larry McDonald and Western goals. And this resume also says that Gordon Novell was confined to the Federal Correctional Institution in Butler, North Carolina in 1978, and it was confirmed by the facilities there that he was put into Butler for heavy behavior modification practices. Now, I wasn't aware that Gordon Novell was recycled through that institution, but he's worked with all levels of the CIA and the people that were behind the murder of John Kennedy. And Novell came into the Flynt operation at a time where Larry Flynt was obviously drugged and beat down. And his latest symptom, as I say, is handing over the Hustler to Madeleine Murray O'Hair. In 1973, in my article in The Realist, the Senate Select Committee is part of the cover-up, I had a section called The Martial Law Without the Riots. And I have the article, of course, the magazine's at home, and David Emery turned to a section and sent it back to remind me what I wrote in there. I said that there are institutions that had to be dismantled, such as the UCLA Institute to Study the Causes of Violent Behavior. That's the one that Ronald Reagan set up. And NSKIDS, ENSKIDS, which is part of the National Security Council, 1974, the act of infiltrating the United States whenever necessary. It's a provision for the CIA to work in the United States. And then I mentioned the United States Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, where they had Larry Flynt, and also Butler, North Carolina, where he is now. As I say, the finale of this saga, it's not the last story or the end of it, but it's interesting that Madeleine Murray, who now turns out to have associations with Lee and Marina, some kind, and I'm anxious to see what those are. I'll have to follow that up. It's that she had a role in that, and now she infiltrated also the Larry Flynt home and his operation and business. Another listener sent me a page from Eagle magazine, June 1984, about Mitchell WerBell, who I've mentioned on a lot of broadcasts, and how he moved into Larry's home along with Novell and these various characters, Timothy Leary. And this article refers to him as a soldier of fortune, a strong anti-communist who died December 16, 1983, and he was working as a security consultant to Larry Flynt, and it goes into his allegations of CIA contracts, working with Robert Vesco, working as a hitman. Wherever there's somebody to be hired or hit, WerBell would be there, willing to help. Anyone that's on a hit list and wants me to help them, I will. These were the kind of people around the Hustler operation, again, and the articles that come out praising their patriotism and working for Flynt. And then, of course, WerBell died in Los Angeles in December, but Novell and Madeline Murray O'Hara and a whole gang of them are still around and can continue to do a lot of harmful things. Now, there are so many stories in the news. I was mentioning it earlier on the talk show, part of this program, the half-hour section where I take calls. I have a pile of important articles. I just started typing some this week on gum labels to put in a book where I can have access to them and know where they're filed. And one day I was spent maybe doing 120 top articles, the newspaper, the source, the date. There's just so much. But I'm going to put most of those aside, get to them eventually, and I'm going to talk about Edwin Meese because he's so important. And if the special prosecutor is assigned to the case, it will take several months, and then we have time to send in more ammunition and look for more leads and go after this fellow. I have done 2 specific broadcasts on him in this, so this would be part 3. And I spent the last 3 days just cross-filing the Edwin Meese story and breaking it down into the several categories. I have discussed, as I say on the air, sections of him that I'm going to update and show you what I had 2 weeks ago, and then what is broken since then on those various subjects, because the information is filling in very nicely. I have large sheets like 10 by 12 inches, and if you hear paper rattling, it's because I couldn't break them off the big sheets. I didn't want to, so I brought them into the station, and I type in columns and put down different subjects because there's so many facets of the Edwin Meese story. And I have several pages on the chronology, the dates, and the way the events come down to fall in chronological order: when stock was sold, when it was bought, when somebody did him a favor, when they got a promotion, his past career with various people. And I put that always when I start a detailed study of a particular issue or person in chronological order. Then I have several pages of the hanky-panky to be investigated, and then that breaks into subjects like the Carter papers, the military promotions, the house loans, the involvement of promoting people, the General Services Administration, the postal clerk, not declaring the earnings that he had, keeping his interest out of his tax records, not telling the White House or other people, allegedly not telling them about stock that his wife bought. So I have all of these various, what could be crimes, in various columns to see how they go. And then the BIOTECH Corporation. And I want to go into that in detail because that's the one that caught my fancy that I talked about last week, and I want to spend time this evening on the BIOTECH. But the categories I broke: the Watergate gang, which people working with Reagan that are involved in these scandals now tie back to Watergate, and the cancer gang, the medical medical labs. I'm very suspicious of a cancer circuit and the causes of cancer, the treatment, and the way it's become a multinational business. The cancer gang fits into this. The Carter-Reagan papers, the General Services Administration, the military connections, the mafia connections, the California buddies that moved to Washington with Meese and Reagan. And I've broken down these categories: evidence that has been altered, missing, witnesses that have died, questions to ask, where the various appointments are. And I've been separating. It's not easy to take a certain article and then break it down into like 15 or 16 categories and then scotch tape them on pinups so that they read easier. But in the end, it's the only way I can handle all this material. There was a story in the San Jose Mercury this week. Meese joins the list of Reagan officials under a cloud. And many articles have said that Reagan has remained untarnished. In fact, I was told on national television, NBC, this last week, Sunday night, there was a story about him being protected like Teflon, and maybe the cracks are beginning to show. He's had so many appointments that are under fire, and they began to list them in the newspaper, approximately at least 45 of them, who've been ensnarled in ethically questionable or illegal businesses. This article says Meese is not alone. 45 people from the Reagan administration have been caught with questionable professional practices before or during their government service, and some left the government service because the stories were about to break. At least 24 resigned or were fired. Only one has been convicted. Others have been criticized and censured by internal investigations. Many resisted calls for their resignation. Some, like Secretary of the Navy John Lehman, have been tied to the lobbyist offices that he represented, and then he got into the Navy and gave those people big contracts. Some leave and then are investigated or not even reprimanded for business ventures that they will profit by tremendously. But no administration, I don't think, has ever had such a long list. At least 24 resigned. And then there's some that don't even come in, like the periphery links like Frank Sinatra and Johnny Carson putting on the inauguration, and news stories of Giancana and the links of Sinatra to the mob, or Johnny Carson's closeness to Jack Catane and John DeLorean and the cocaine crown of Hollywood, Robert Durand and DeLorean Motors. These people around them are not visible now in any sense, but on the periphery are these various scandals. Paul Laxalt and articles in the Sacramento Bee and Las Vegas of sure mafia connections to Paul Laxalt. There are endless people that should be called in, even Helene vonDamm, who uses Christian vonDamm's name, who's married to Byron Leeds, and he's down there with the Bank of America in Bolivia and could have very strong links to Klaus Barbie and the cocaine connections down there. These people aren't called for questioning, so around Reagan, if there's at least 45 who've been ensnarled and 24 have resigned, I could have a list of 45 that should be called, and then that guy should just maybe be hung on the heels like Mussolini, but that won't ever happen. One large story, I don't know if it went on the wire services, Saturday, March 24th, 1984, that I'll bring up right away because I hinted the mafia connections that there was more to this money tree. Shake that money tree, because nobody who has wheeled and dealed as much as Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan, the two of them for 17 years, there's no way that a $16,000 investment in a company called BIOTECH, that we would guess that this would shake these people out. But it was run by Dr. Earl Bryan, and I knew it would be important. Now it turns out that BIOTECH has a subsidiary that's involved with 800 slot machines in Las Vegas, and that's only the beginning. The story is a front page San Francisco Examiner. Meese's wife tied to illegal Vegas slot deal. That's the future Attorney General, tied to illegal slot machines. And then the large black letters say Meese, Meese's wife tied, just without the illegal on the front page, to slot deal. And page 2, it's the illegal slot deal. That the wife's firm broke the Small Business Administration's gaming laws and got a $5 million loan as a special favor, and we'll go into that in detail, at a time that they were buying a company with slot machines in Las Vegas, 800, 700 slot machines in Las Vegas, and goodness knows what else. But the reading of the article is so complicated that when you get to the company called QUESTECH, QUESTECH, that is one of the numerous BIOTECH subsidiaries. Dr. Earl Bryan runs the BIOTECH, and as these numerous, and every one of them should be listed, that they loan money to slot machine operations. But then it says the gambling investment was made in the form of a loan to a Las Vegas company, not named, owned by a second firm, not named. The parent company then loaned the money to a third firm, not named, which used it to buy two other companies, not named, that owned 6 and 200 slot machines, respectively. Now, the Senate Judiciary is supposed to handle that. Congressman Metzenbaum's office has this information, but the point is that Paul Laxalt, Senator Paul Laxalt, is on the judiciary, and it would be interesting to see if he bows out or what his position is, because, as I said before, when we got to BIOTECH, there was the big story, and then the connections led there, but I don't know if the committee has all that information. I assume that they'll have to go into all those branches of the BIOTECH, but don't give them too much credit. They'll try to limit, and I understand William French Smith will try to limit the range that they can ask. What 4 areas are you going to ask him? and no more. But there can be an appeal later if you don't like the range, and that's where we have to get the ammunition going. Now, I mentioned BIOTECH last week, and there's more that I've put together this week. And Dr. Stuart Bryan has been a long associate of Edwin Meese, and he and Edwin Thomas. Edwin Thomas is the man who was asked by J. Pendleton James, and we'll do more on him, to get that house sold of Mr. Meese, that he was going through too many problems. And Thomas and Meese and Stuart Bryan all worked with Ronald Reagan when he was the governor of California. Edwin Thomas was named Regional Director of General Services Administration in San Francisco. First, he went to the White House and helped Edwin Meese as the deputy under Edwin Meese, which would be one of the most important jobs in the White House. This is the fellow that got the house sale moving and then went out to General Services. Now, Dr. Earl Bryan, according to the news sources, may have gotten his security clearance from Edwin Meese. It doesn't say why he needed it. When Ronald Reagan became president of the United States, why Earl Bryan would need it. He not only worked in California with the health, education, welfare under Reagan, but he served on the California Council of Criminal Justice. Now, I told you I have articles filed way back. I'm keeping up with the current things, and we'll get back to the old Earl Bryan. But he wasn't just a doctor. He worked with Meese in this oppressive, what I call the bloodbath, the California terrorist syndrome that came down in California. He served on the criminal justice system. James Jenkins, who's Meese's deputy, presidential counselor, said that Mrs. Meese knew of BIOTECH in September of 1980, but she bought it for 3 days after the inauguration. Now, she's being investigated, and I have on a separate sheet all possible investigations for knowing in advance that this company was going on the market to be sold. Remember, they were heavily in debt with one house in California they hadn't sold with a mortgage over $900 a month. A home in Virginia they bought with another $1,300 a month. So 2 days after the inauguration, she has to put $16,000 into Stuart Bryan's company that it turns out gets special favors of a small business loan of up to $16 million, and is one of the companies is bought the slot machines in Vegas. Now, among the firms that BIOTECH has, this one story says that there were many. They have what I consider like large dummy fronts. We don't know much about them, but I'll spell them and tell you the names because it isn't just a simple thing she bought into. The first is Hadron Incorporated, H-A-D-R-O-N Incorporated in Vienna, Virginia. It's laser equipment, and Dr. Earl Bryan is the chairman and the largest stockholder. Incidentally, in BIOTECH, many newspaper articles describe the gentleman who is the vice president of BIOTECH. That happens to be Earl Bryan's father-in-law also. He's the treasurer, the secretary, and the vice president. So it looks like a mom-and-pop operation, which I believed right from the start was some kind of a dummy front with medicine as the overcover, but something more to investigate. Another company they have is Cyclophase, BIOTECH subsidiary, and again, Bryan is a principal stockholder. The city isn't listed or the board of directors. Exidy Systems, California Computer, they purchased for $1.6 million. BIOTECH sued them, and then Exidy, they were supposed to have overstated the price by $1 million, so there's a lawsuit in that company. And last week I mentioned the American Cytogenetics that Mrs. Meese bought into with $500. It has to do with a company in North Hollywood, one of the largest companies that controls Pap smears and the diagnosis of cancer. And as I said, I'm very suspicious of the cancer conspiracy in this country and some of these characters that are involved in cancer. The fifth company is the Associated Biomedic System in Buffalo, New York, where they produce human biological products. BIOTECH has 27% of this company, and they failed the food and drug requirements of the federal government, of their own government, so that is held up in some way. Another is the Financial News Network, in television firm in California, with loans from BIOTECH and options to buy BIOTECH stock for $1 a share. So it does vary how you get in and out of BIOTECH. Another is the new laboratory of American Laboratory, the Cytogenetics, moved to Teaneck, New Jersey, and opened up another branch I'm not sure, is Teaneck where Nixon lives? Is that the old home base, or is that the DeLorean family? April 82, he opened up in Teaneck. They're in Buffalo and Teaneck. And then there is another company that they opened up a small business, a QUESTECH, that the Small Business Administration gave them the money to $5 million up to $16 million on a low interest loan. And this is the one that Mrs. Meese bought into, GUESTECH, a subsidiary of BIOTECH. And the House Civil Service Committee is looking in not only into how Mrs. Thomas got her job after her husband loaned the money to the Meeses to buy into BIOTECH, but there's a question of how they had their own $50,000 or $100,000 to put into BIOTECH. I called Congressman Schroeder's office. They're investigating the Thomas family, and asked what the earnings were of the Thomases that they could put up to $100,000 maybe into a corporation that's never been on the market before. Now, Mrs. Meese got interested in September, and her stock purchase is dated January the 23rd, 1981, right after Reagan was president. But an investigation of the company shows that the stock didn't go on sale until March, so I don't know how she bought it in January when it went on sale in March. The BIOTECH is a wholly owned subsidiary of Capital Corporation, the largest of 8 companies. Were given their license in 1981. There was a moratorium on the licenses. They got favorable interest rates, and only 8 firms were given exemptions. It turned out today that Mr. Strom Thurmond, Senator Thurmond, was objecting to the small business favoritism, even of his own buddy in the Reagan administration. It turned out that of the 8, it was one of the companies was one that he got a favor for, a small business, but evidently the owner didn't move into the White House and become the deputy under the chief of staff there. He has a different title. Meese is really the man who oversees everything that Ronald Reagan does, and Baker is actually chief of staff. So at the same time that they were getting a loan, a federal loan with low interest rates, Mrs. Meese was hurrying to buy stock. She couldn't wait to buy that stock. As I said last week, even though they were heavily in debt, there was some need to buy it. And at the same time, the corporation was illegally investing $100,000 into Las Vegas slot machines, and they're trying to find out if she had inside trading and information. She also sold her stock in these companies that are owned by Brian, the BIOTECH Group, with its subsidiaries, on a given date, and just the next day it dropped completely down to a couple of dollars. It was worthless. She tripled her investment in a short time and seemed to know to sell it just the day before the bottom dropped out, and that also was pretty cute. Now, the Thomases, were they in a position to loan the $16,000? Obviously, they gave it to her. They should have put the money into the home. And Meese failed to disclose the BIOTECH company. Now, he claims that this is quite innocent, that the $16,000 they put into BIOTECH was unimportant. But isn't it interesting, the one that he failed to disclose is the one that has the slot machines in Las Vegas? He said he didn't know how the stock was acquired, and it was acquired from Mr. Thomas, who told him to buy from Earl Bryan. All 3 had worked together for 15 or 17 years. They were all close buddies, and Meese said he didn't know how it was acquired. And then when they went to search for a BIOTECH, evidently through the phone directory or somewhere, Meese didn't know where it was or who it was. They looked it up and found the company was in Maryland. And yet, James Jenkins, who's the deputy to Meese, was the point of reference for a man named Dwight Geduldig, Geduldig. He joined BIOTECH. He had worked in California with Reagan and Meese and Dr. Bryan. He was the chief of Medicaid in California, and he wants a reference to work for this company, and he gets it from James Jenkins, who's the direct assistant deputy under Edwin Meese. And then when the story comes out about BIOTECH, they don't know what the company is or where it was, even though they gave references to somebody that they worked with through the years and who also helped bail Meese out of his housing problems. Now, the Small Business Administration, of course, will be looking into that loan. When they found out and investigated it, they turned over papers to the Senate Judiciary that they challenged the slot machine investment, and they told QUESTECH to get rid of the interest, but you didn't see anybody fired. You didn't see them tell Meese, stop being in there. The small business loan goes to slot machines. It's absolutely against the law to put money into gambling machines, federal money to start a small business with that kind of operation. Mr. Guttledig listed James Jenkins as the man who gave his reference to begin working for QUESTECH, which is part of BIOTECH, and that's the man, as I say, who headed Medicaid for Ronald Reagan in the state of California. The article that was in the newspaper, one of them, has not named these companies. We have to get who owns the second company, who owns the third company, who they sold to two other companies. There are already 5 unnamed companies and people that are involved, so it'll get larger. We'll take a 1-minute break now and then get back to some more on Edwin Meese. In the meantime, I always ask you to help the station. I don't know how their finances are doing. Kazoo may have some parties or things to get together, and I'm sure they'll be having other things. I couldn't get to the last affair they had because I was in Los Angeles that Sunday night, but there will be concerts and ways also to support this station where we can all chip in and do something for them. And I think that it would be nice to know that everybody who listens to the broadcast has a little piece of Kazoo that they put money in to say, I appreciate the broadcast. And if you do that, I appreciate it too, and that would be great. Now we'll do side 2. This is broadcast number. This is side 2 of broadcast 642, and it's Mae Brussell, KAZU FM. I'm going back to Edwin Meese and some of the details about this fellow. As I say, with 2 expensive mortgages, his wife is in a position to throw $6,000 a loan, to take a loan and put money into this company, more than 6, it's 15,000 rather, into BIOTECH with its questionable background. Now, I'm wondering about Dr. Stuart Bryan, and I'll tell you where I'm leading with a lot of the research and the way it's adding up, and it has all along. Dr. Stuart Bryan, besides bringing in the head of Medicaid of California and serving on the California Council of Criminal Justices, I'm wondering if these various people are part of dummy front CIA military intelligence, the same way that the invisible government describes these operations. The Weiss book on American behind the scenes, or Fletcher Prouty's book, The Secret Team, or Victor Marchetti's book on United States espionage establishment. And I wonder if this is the raw nerves that we're seeing that got caught on this one little loan that she took from Edwin Thomas that gave her, without any interest, to buy in at a time they didn't need the company. In some way, they were swept into something they didn't need that goes back, all of these people, back to the Reagan secret teams. Then this was, as I say, California, the first para-fascist state. And where are these dummy friends going to leave? Will they go into them? Interest-free loans. Now, the people involved in putting up this money for the Meeses and for helping them sell that house, one moved, he had a job in the White House, and he moved out to San Francisco as regional director of the General Services Administration. And I want to get to the links of the General Services Administration in one moment, because I think that's very important. And Gretchen Thomas, his wife, moved to the Merit Systems Protection Board, and their son Tad worked for the federal government until recently and then moved out to California. Now, I am concerned about the General Services because there's a new appointment that Ronald Reagan is trying to make for General Services that is among his list of problem people. I don't know if you have read about it. It's a name named Jack. Have you read in the paper about Jack L. Courtemanche, Courtemanche? Now, he put Mr. Thomas, Edwin Thomas, his long friend of Dr. Bryan, friend of the head of Medicaid, into strategic positions, and Mr. Thomas is out in San Francisco with the General Services Administration. And just this month, Ronald Reagan picked ahead with General Services a man, this Jack Courtemanche. Right now, his appointment is being held up by a large multi-million-dollar suit against him for fraud and for changing information on a company he sold. General Services is an important part of the federal government. They spend $6.6 billion a year, and they have this man's been accused of questionable practices before he ever gets his hands on that money. He is involving the purchase or the selling of the Crown Coach Corporation, which is a bus manufacturing, oldest school bus company in the United States. He had the Crown Corporation, and he sold it to a group of investors in January of 1983, and the price was $7.1 million. And there were promissory notes that were supposed to come back of $1.1 million to Mr. Cordamanchi. And the man who bought the bus companies countersued. There's a $30 million suit against Jack Cordamanchi, Courtemanche, a $30 million suit for misrepresentation of his business. Now, this man is supposed to be the boss of Mr. Thomas, Edwin Thomas, who set up the Meeses. He would be boss of a lot of people like that. But Mr. Thomas in San Francisco, and his appointment's being held up. Now, the charges about him were listed in a newspaper this year, January 31st, 1984, the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Cordamanchi misrepresented the company. He said there was a pre-tax profit of $1.8 million. It actually was half that amount. When he sold the company, he removed cash from the company without telling the buyers. Imagine what he would do with our $6 billion budget. He took for himself a payment of $125,000, and it was supposed to be $16,000. The audit after the sale showed that the inventory was overstated by $1 million. Items listed in the inventory were not in the warehouse. This is March 14th, 1984, Wall Street Journal. Items listed in the inventory were not there. He concealed other liabilities of $690,000. He was asked if the company buildings were earthquake-proof and standard, checked out in case of floods or other damages. He said yes, they were, and the new buyers had to put in $350,000. He told the new owners when they bought the company to give bonuses to workers for goodwill to ensure their employment, and later they found out that it was going to all of his friends who then left the company and weren't with the company. Now, this isn't one personality problem. This is a lawsuit, a $30 million lawsuit against a man who's going to head the General Services Administration. And he told that after they gave the bonuses to particular people and they got a lush bonus, then they walked out, and then he concealed and misrepresented facts so that they had to pay more than $2.5 million than the stock was worth. Now, what did Mr. Cordamanchi say about this when he was asked? He said, this is in the Wall Street Journal, he didn't deny that this was true, that the financial records were inaccurate. But he said the buyers never asked a guarantee that the unaudited figures were correct. He gave them the papers, and they didn't have somebody come in, and he didn't guarantee they were correct. The buyer beware, it's up to you. And they never said that, he never said to them that they should rely on anything he said when they bought the company, and that the purchasers were not notified of his bonus, but they could have found out if they wanted to. So this is his argument. Now, the interesting thing about Jack Cordamanchi with this track record, and I'm going down all the details about him, because he's the new selected out of the 45 people that Reagan's had trouble with. This would be 46 or 94, I don't know which order. But the way he misrepresented so many things on the company. But in California, he was an executive director before appointed to the General Services in the White House conference. He helped the White House, and he was an official as a liaison in the Office of Public Liaison. He served National Finance Chairman of Reagan's 1976 presidential campaign, but he ran the 1978 campaign of Mike Curb to be the lieutenant governor. And if you don't live in California, you may not remember the story of Mike Curb, or if you get my tapes, you can get back to Mike Curb. In 1979, this is way back to broadcast 405, I was talking about the dirty tricks of the political campaigns, the hidden money even the kill money, and it was about Ken Reitz from Watergate, who became the head of Mike Kerb's operation when Kerb became lieutenant governor in California. And I talked about Lynn Nofziger and his hanky-panky with these people in the same administration in Watergate and later with Reagan and with these people. But what I was saying in 1979 was that Kenneth Reitz managed Kerb's election. Well, if he managed Kerb's election, Mr. Cordamanchi was the campaign manager also. And along with them was Evil Younger, who also was campaigning for governor. And Ken Reitz had been youth director of Nixon's 1972 campaign of dirty tricks, of spying, because you're reading in the paper the story of the spy sedan chair, Mr. Stone, who worked against Mr. McGovern and Muskie and Humphrey, and then began spying on Jimmy Carter for Ronald Reagan's administration. And I said in 1979, the most dangerous money, the links that are never exposed and protected for future use. Beware of the Kerb Reitz, because you will be in danger. Now, that was in 1979, and as I've said many times, tomorrow becomes today, and now today comes the time where a man that was running the campaign for Mike Kerb wants to be the head of the special important General Services Administration and is being exposed for the track record that he had. Also, there was a broadcast that I did on Mike Kerb's relationship to Jack Eggers, that they tried to coax Governor Brown, who had Lieutenant Governor Mike Kerb under him, and they tried to get Jack Egger of the Beverly Hills Police Department for a post in the Narcotic Addict Evaluation Authority. Jack Egger, a former police captain in Beverly Hills, left the public service 3 years earlier when his name was linked to the murder of a private detective, Bobby Hall. This was December 1979, and Ronald Reagan's son, Mike Reagan, and Mike Kerb were trying to get Egger to be working with the administration on narcotics. Egger, as chief of police in Beverly Hills, was responsible for Bobby Hall and a whole group of people drugging Howard Hughes in the bungalow, the Beverly Hills Hotel, from 1957 to 1966. And he's still around. Evidently, Egger is still working with the police departments. He was kicked out of Beverly Hills because of his role in knowing that a murder was going to take place of a detective. They called him before and after. Now, Jack Egger was working with G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt and the Watergators that broke into the Dr. Lewis Fielding's offices in Beverly Hills. There also was a thing, many broadcasts I did on the very controversial air flight that Lieutenant Merv Donnelly was supposed to take down to San Diego on a Sunday night or Monday morning, and he took the Sunday night plane and didn't tell anybody, and it was that Monday morning plane that blew up over San Diego that I did many updates on, just as I did the Air Florida plane crash. Very suspicious circumstances. And Mr. Franchetti, who was supposed to be appointed under Governor Dumachin for an important job, was not appointed just recently because of his role in harassing Merv Donnelly, who was running against Mike Kerb. So when you get Jack Cordamanchi about to be head of General Services Administration, with a track record of just the company he sold and working with Ronald Reagan for a long time, and under him again would be Mr. Edwin Thomas, who is the fellow involved with getting the money to the Meeses to put into Dr. Stuart Bryan's BIOTECH with all of these various dummy fronts that I've been going into. Now, there are many connections to the Watergate gang here in the Meese story, but as long as Watergate wasn't cleaned up, the history repeats itself and you get the same people. And I'll go through some of the Watergaters, like the Ken Reitz, Mike Kerb connections with you in a moment. As I say, there are a lot of categories that I could continue on, and I will the rest of the hour and then maybe next week. Last week on broadcast 641, I listed 8 appointments that were promotions for favors that were received by the Meese family alone, that they did favors for them. And I knew that there's more than just buying a house, selling one house in San Diego and buying a house in Washington. There's more than 8 favors or promotions or trying to keep your army promotion in the reserves because then he'd get 18% more money when he wasn't supposed to get any, and the money tree had died up for Edwin Meese. So I just want to update the first 8 promotions. One was Ed Gray of San Diego Savings and Loan, Gordon Luce from San Diego Savings. One went to the Federal Home Loan Bank. Luce went to the United Nations as the appointed U.S. mission. Thomas Barrack, who put up $70,000 for the Meeses and later got a job with the Department of Interior. Under James Watts, John McKean went into the Postal Service. He arranged an $80,000 loan for the Meeses, and he also is his financier right now. When there are questions about his taxes, the discrepancies, they said he had to go John McKean. The financier for Ronald Reagan's personal money, one of them, is Mr. Wilson, who got an appointment as the ambassador to the Vatican. Edwin Thomas, who got a job in Washington and then in San Francisco with the Federal Services Administration. That's really 2 favors. He was shifted 2 times. Major General Thomas Turnage, who worked for Meese's quick promotion in the Army, and Reagan announced him to be Director of Selective Service. Gretchen Thomas, the wife of the gentleman who got Mrs. Meese the $16,000 loan, who went to the Merit Systems Protection Board. Herbert Ellingwood, Meese's longtime associate, who hired Gretchen, and then it became chairman. He went out west to become chairman of the Merit System and brought her out from Washington to join him and work there. Those were 8 different jobs in connection to the Army promotion and to selling one home in California. Now to go on with some of the other favors, BIOTECH got a $5 million business loan at a time that they weren't supposed to get it from small business. That's being investigated, and the very first person to put the money she couldn't afford, $16,000, into BIOTECH was Edwin Meese's wife in January, and by June they had a $5 million up to $6 million loan. Number 10 was special tax exemption from small business. They could get their loan for a very small amount, so they not only got the $5,000, but they got a tax exemption along with it, that favor, and that includes that they can get money up to $16 million and invest it in all these various places in Maryland and Vienna, Virginia, and Buffalo, goodness knows where else, all around the globe. They could be front door operations that are mainly owned by Dr. Stuart Bryan and his father-in-law, and you don't know what in the heck is going on with these operations. Edwin Thomas went out to California and left the White House, where he was working with this important job with Edwin Meese, to take his position out in California. Major General William Berkman was the second person in the Army that got a promotion besides Mr. Turnage. He was about to retire, but Ronald Reagan announced the day that he was supposed to retire that he had been hired for a 4-year term. These men did favors for Edwin Meese. One rushed through an appointment that had a deadline of like 2 days, or he would have lost his reserve in the military, and the other created a job in the military that hadn't been available since 1969. It was outdated in the Selective Service, and so one was promoted to be head of the Selective Service, and the other was confirmed in the military to stay on for another 4 years. That's Major General Thomas Turnage and Major General William Berkman. Now, Tad Thomas, the 22-year-old son of Edwin and Gretchen, also was on the payroll. While Dad made $70,000 and Mom was making $30,000, he got a job in October '82 of $16,500. This is the 22-year-old son of the man who gives $16,000 for Mrs. Meese to put into BIOTECH for whatever reason. We haven't figured out why she had to do that yet. So Tad was not required. He got special favors. He was not required to go through normal civil service procedures. Instead of him going through that, if he would need a steady job, they kept writing 2 30-day slots of temporary. And then after skirting the procedures, he was given a political appointment which exempts him from civil service. So he worked on until June '83. Dr. Stuart Bryan got his security clearance from Edwin Meese, and Edwin Meese also wrote the incorporation papers for Lynn Nofziger in 1979. That's interesting because Nofziger is the business partner of Helene vonDamm, and a listener called me. His San Francisco Chronicle had a story that the Senate Judiciary wants to call Helene vonDamm back from Vienna to see about the hiring practices of these people. And I think that's getting a little closer to it, that her Gestapo connections with Otto von Bolschwing could go through a combination of these medical fronts that I'm very suspicious of. I'm sure that none of the White House staff want to answer questions. They've said they don't want to, so maybe they'll have to be subpoenaed on how these people got their jobs. Now, Edwin Meese, while he wasn't making the mortgage payments, was getting deeper into debt. So E. Pendleton James, working in the White House, asked Thomas Barrack to help Meese out. And Barrack quickly got to work and went to the Great American Federal Savings and arranged a $240,000 sale at a favorable rate. And you know most of the story of how that house was sold and transferred. And the man behind the arrangements in the White House was E. Pendleton James, who said Meese has a house he can't sell. Now, I don't know why you need all that weight to get a house going. If it's worth $300,000, he could sell it for $250,000. And if he's only making $13,000 at the University of San Diego, which I learned this week is a very conservative Catholic university. It's like the university that Robert Morris has in Dallas. It is not a state university. It's a private. It's similar to the Georgetown University, funded by the Mellon family, just like the Georgetown, and where he was teaching and where he operated was a very conservative Catholic university. Well, E. Pendleton James, a White House personnel director, he followed Helene vonDamm, but he was in the White House personnel with her, was, as I said, was the person who suggested that Thomas arranged to sell the house. So just briefly, I got out some early articles on E. Pendleton James. From the New York Times, there was one November the 7th, 1980. James was working for the Nixon administration. This was another one of the Watergate gang. He was personnel manager 1971 till 1973. He left the ship when the Watergate arrests came, so he would look clean. He was hiring people, personnel under the Nixon White House under Fred Malek. Malek was never prosecuted at the time of Watergate. He even discussed how he had a hunting accident, I believe killed his own father, similar to Earl Warren's story. Fred Malek was a far right-winger in the Nixon administration that should have been investigated for breaking certain laws under the Constitution, certain civil rights. He worked for him, so if he was hiring, again, he was hiring the White House plumbers and James McCord with the secret 16-man military unit. See, I think that the Garden Plot, which I'm not going into tonight, and a lot of people have information on, I can do more next week. Ronald Reagan saying at those meetings in 1969 that if people heard me, they'd think I was planning a dictatorship. And in 1971, 2 years later, he talks about it. Well, is this like a military takeover? See, the Squad 19 that came out of the LAPD and Jack Eggers, the Beverly Police Department, these people are still operational. And he was in the White House with the plumbers, McCord, Ehrlichman, Haldeman. He recruited William Simon for the Federal Energy Administration. Simon became Secretary of the Treasury. In 1976, he headed a recruiting team in Los Angeles, and he works for a recruiting firm. His three major clients, dig this, are Dart Industries, Bank of America, and Hughes Aircraft. Recruiting, does he recruit Christian vonDamm to be vice president in Bolivia, where Klaus Barbie is? Who does he hire? Dart Industries, that's of course the Reagan kitchen cabinet. Hughes Aircraft, which was a cover and has been for espionage and the Medical Institute. Millions of dollars, again, into experimentations. We have no record of what they do. But the Dart Industries, the Bank of America, and Hughes Aircraft, hiring for those people you could send. The Odessa Network, and these dummy fronts and these corporations have some much more deep meaning than just having to be a place that Mrs. Meese invested in. I have a list of her investment stocks. Incidentally, she owns into Sterling Drug, which is IG Farben, into Edison Company, into Light Companies, Utilities. Edwin Meese put all of his stocks into her name, and they're blue chip stocks. There isn't anything like 16,000 into this seedy operation, the BIOTECH. There has to be some other reason why they got them tangled into BIOTECH. And as I put the pieces together, it gets more interesting. As I said, I've been working just 3 days on separating these articles. Now, Pendleton James, he hires for the military for the Aerojet General Corporation in Sacramento. He was up there for the Douglas Oil Company, for various hirings for military contracts and parts also. So he has to be part of DISC. Defense Industry Security Command, which screens out people working for the military, and certainly if he hires somebody to be the head of the Federal Energy Administration with NASA and the Nazis, and even Joseph Mengeles, I understand there's documents working for the energy group, and Knoxville, Tennessee, the energy business is ripe with Project Paperclip and the scientists, and if he's hiring those people, Pendleton James is the very person who tells Mr. Thomas to bail out the Meeses out of their home. Now, Meeses, I would speculate, I don't speculate too much on the program, but just given the set of facts now, I would speculate that what we're getting is just little trickles of little things that they're covering a much bigger story and a lot more money, and that at his confirmation hearing, rather than bring up all the nitty-gritty, they're going to squeeze him out with the little things like they did at Watergate and really not get into the big things, just like they got Spiro Agnew out on some minor little detail with a slap on the wrist and no time in jail, where he was illegally funneling money from the Greek military junta into the CIA to get himself the vice presidency. As a matter of fact, David Emery called this week to tell me that in the book on the Vatican, one of the books on the Vatican, I have the pages at home and I'll share it with you later, that Michael Sindona was working with the Greek military dictatorship, and he also was building the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., and working with Richard Nixon and Maurice Stans and Spiro Agnew. So there is a much bigger story. Now, the Watergate law in 1975, the Office of the Watergate Special Prosecutor, in their final report, said that to handle crimes at the government's highest level, they recommended that the Senate refuse to confirm as Attorney General or any other high Justice Department appointee any person serving as the president's campaign manager or similar role, which is the role that Edwin Meese had. The 1977 Senate Ethics and Government Act said any individual who played a leading partisan role in a president's election shall not be named the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General. And this passed the Senate twice. It was dropped in the House, and they say now they have a chance to follow this through. Edwin Meese was receiving information from Robert Stone. He denied this, and furthermore, he's suspected of having forged documents on this case because he used Mr. Sedan Chair, the spy for George McGovern, and for Hubert Humphrey and Mr. Mudsky, and was using information to spy on the Carter administration for Ronald Reagan's election. The New York Times has a story March 23rd that Edwin Meese had lunch with a middleman discussing Mr. Stone and other agents about Reagan, and that person is now dead. It said he discussed it. Now, there's a listener of these broadcasts in Philadelphia who works with the FBI who called me today, and I told him to call Washington and call me back tomorrow, the next day, and ask the New York Times reporter, who did Mr. Meese have lunch with and how did he die? Because as long as these stories begin to unfold, you find that the connecting links between the evidence and the cover-up, those primary witnesses are murdered. I don't even have time tonight to go into the news story of Billy Saul Estes on Lyndon Johnson and his role in having a judge and a fellow was investigating the cotton frauds and active with the cotton scandals in Texas, that Lyndon Johnson had him murdered because he was the middleman between Johnson's career and Billy Saul Estes' crimes, and they didn't want to be caught with those. Well, this Jack Cordomanchi, who would become head of the General Services Administration, is working with Mike Kerb, who hired Ken Reitz of Watergate. Ken Reitz worked with Robert Haldeman, the secret fund, the dirty money, the dirtiest tricks, and that's why they were covered up at the time of Watergate, because they were dirty tricks. So you have those links. And Mr. Lynn Nofziger of Watergate fame, who worked with John Mitchell and the American Nazi Party, who's a co-business partner with Helene vonDamm, had Edwin Meese writing corporation papers for him, and we don't know which company that was of his many companies that he has. And E. Pendleton James, of course, of the Watergate, who hired these various people at the White House, plumbers involved in these scandals that aren't far from Ronald Reagan's entire career. And Jack Agers not only was drugging Howard Hughes, but there was no Hughes in Vegas, and Paul Laxalt, who runs the GOP finances, knows it. So E. Pendleton James, with his hiring people from the Atomic Energy Secretary of Treasury, Howard Hughes Organization, the Bank of America, and Dart Associates, Dart Industries. These are very powerful people that are hanging over some Watergate that we have to keep investigating. Well, now I see my time is up. I have a reminder here that the time is gone. This is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week, and we'll continue on the story of Edwin Meese and a little more information on Meese and what else is going on in the world. In the meantime, take care of yourself, and I'll be back with you next week.